Beneath it, a note in a child's scrawl read, "You can't get rid of me that easily. Merry Christmas forever." It was a week before Christmas, and I was rushing through the toy store, desperate to find a last-minute gift for my niece, Ellie. She'd specifically asked for a doll, but not just any doll. It had to be a Christmas doll, something special for the holiday. Most of the shelves were already picked clean, with only a few random toys left behind. But as I turned down one of the last aisles, I spotted it, a doll sitting alone on a lower shelf, almost as if it were waiting for me. The doll was beautiful in a slightly eerie way, with large glassy eyes, golden curls, and a red velvet dress trimmed with lace. She wore a delicate white bonnet and held a tiny, tarnished bell in one hand. I felt an odd chill as I picked her up, but she was perfect. Ellie would love her. I brought her home, wrapped her up, and put her under the tree, relieved to have found something. But that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I thought I heard the faintest jingling sound, like a tiny bell ringing. I chalked it up to my imagination and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The doll's position had shifted. When I'd placed her under the tree, she'd been upright, leaning against a box, but now she was lying on her side, facing away from the other presents. I figured it must have been the cat batting her around, so I picked her up and put her back. But that night, the jingling sound returned, this time louder and more insistent, echoing through the dark. I sat up in bed, listening intently, and swore I could hear something else, a faint, whispery giggle. I shivered, pulling the covers closer, telling myself it was just the wind outside. But that night, the jingling sound returned, this time louder and more insistent, echoing through the dark. I sat up in bed, listening intently, and swore I could hear something else, a faint, whispery giggle. I shivered, pulling the covers closer, telling myself it was just the wind outside. The following morning, I found the doll in the kitchen. I froze, staring down at it, feeling my skin crawl. There was no way it could have moved on its own, and I didn't have a roommate or anyone else who would play a prank on me. My nerves were on edge, but I didn't want to admit that a doll was freaking me out. I grabbed it, wrapped it even tighter, and shoved it to the back of the tree. But that night was worse. I woke up to the sound of tiny footsteps, light and pattering, moving from the living room toward my bedroom. I held my breath, heart pounding, as the footsteps came closer, stopping just outside my door. The room was silent, tense, like the air was waiting. I didn't dare get up. I just lay there, staring at the door, too scared to move. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I heard the faint jingle of the bell once more, growing softer and softer until it faded completely. The next morning, I was too shaken to even touch the doll. I decided to call Ellie's mom and let her know I'd picked out something else instead, that the doll wasn't the right choice. But just as I was reaching for my phone, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, on the floor in front of my bedroom door, were tiny footprints in a line of ash, leading back to the tree. My hands were trembling as I wrapped the doll up tightly in an old blanket and stuffed it in the closet. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore, but as I closed the closet door, I swore I saw its glassy eyes flicker, like it was watching me, waiting. I hardly slept that night, every creak and groan of the house making my skin prickle. But when I finally fell asleep, I had a terrible dream. In it, I was a child, standing alone in a snow-covered field, clutching the doll in my arms. It whispered to me, its voice soft and taunting, telling me things I couldn't understand, its tiny bell jingling with each word. When I woke up, the doll was sitting on the chair across from my bed, staring straight at me. I wanted to scream but felt like I couldn't breathe, trapped in a nightmarish haze. Somehow I'd locked it in the closet, yet there it was in my room waiting. I picked it up with shaking hands and drove straight to the nearest lake. Snow was falling, and the world felt ghostly and quiet as I marched to the water's edge. Without hesitation, I threw the doll into the freezing water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. But when I turned to go back to the car, I heard the faintest jingle of that tiny bell, echoing from somewhere deep below the ice. I ran back to the car, refusing to look back, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that lake as possible. Christmas came and went without incident, and I started to believe I'd finally rid myself of the cursed doll. But 1 week later, I received a package in the mail unmarked with no return address. I opened it slowly, feeling my heart drop as I recognized the red velvet dress, the golden curls, the glassy eyes staring up at me with a cold, knowing look. There, resting in her tiny hand, was the bell, perfectly polished, shining brighter than ever. And beneath it, a note in a child's scrawl read, "You can't get rid of me that easily. Merry Christmas forever." I haven't slept since. I'd always loved sending Christmas cards, taking the time to pick out each one carefully, scrawling out thoughtful messages to friends and family. But last year, an unusual card arrived in my mailbox a few days before Christmas. There was no return address, just my name written on the envelope in looping, old-fashioned handwriting. I assumed it was from a distant relative or maybe a friend I'd lost touch with, so I opened it without much thought. But the moment I held it in my hands, a chill swept over me. The card itself was strange, made of thick, slightly yellowed paper, with an intricate design of a Victorian street scene. Men and women in period clothing gathered around a grand tree in the center of a snowy square, their faces faded and almost blurred, like the card was too old to clearly make out any details. Inside, there was a simple message, wishing you a very Merry Christmas. Remember, we're always closer than you think. Beneath the message, there was no signature, just a small sketch of an eye. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The handwriting was elegant, but something about it seemed hurried, almost frantic. I tossed the card onto the coffee table, chalking it up to some strange holiday prank, and tried to forget about it. But later that night, as I was wrapping presents, I noticed the card had moved. I could have sworn I'd left it on the coffee table, but now it was propped up on the mantel, facing the room as though it were watching me. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I'd been moving things around all night. Maybe I'd placed it there without thinking. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though someone was watching me, lurking just outside my line of vision. Shadows flickered at the edges of my room, and a chill settled over me, despite the heater running full blast. The next morning, I was relieved to wake up and find that everything was normal. But when I went to make my morning coffee, I found the card again, sitting upright in the middle of the kitchen table. I felt a spike of unease. I was certain I hadn't put it there. I reached for it, intending to throw it away, but something stopped me. A strange compulsion took over, like the card was waiting for me to pick it up. As I held it, the faded image on the front seemed different. The figures, once blurred, were now clear, and the people in the scene appeared familiar. The man standing by the tree looked a bit like my grandfather, who'd passed away years ago. And next to him was a woman who resembled my mother, her face just as I remembered from my childhood Christmases. I told myself it was a coincidence, a strange trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the people on the card were somehow connected to me. I tossed it in the trash, determined to forget about it. That evening, as I sat down to watch a Christmas movie, a soft knock sounded on my door. It was nearly midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Heart pounding, I peered through the peephole. The front porch was empty, but on the doormat lay the Christmas card, pristine and untouched, as though it had never been thrown away. My hands shook as I picked it up, and when I opened it, a new message had appeared beneath the first. "We're waiting for you." I slammed the door shut and locked it, my pulse racing. I didn't sleep at all that night, listening to every creak and groan of the house, imagining footsteps in the hall, whispers just outside my bedroom door. The next morning, I called my friend Sarah, desperate for some reassurance. She listened to my story in silence, and when I was done, she asked, "Are you sure it's not just someone messing with you? Who would go to this much trouble?" I asked, but even as I spoke, I could feel my heart sinking. What if it was more than just a prank? Sarah promised to come over and stay with me for a few days. When she arrived, I felt a rush of relief, as though her presence could somehow ward off the strange happenings. We spent the day baking cookies, wrapping gifts, and watching Christmas movies. For a little while, I almost forgot about the card. But that night, as we were getting ready for bed, Sarah gasped. She pointed to the coffee table, where the card lay, once again pristine and seemingly untouched. Her face was pale. "I thought you threw that out." "So did I whispered, my voice barely audible. We opened it together, our hands trembling, and a new message had appeared. One more night. Be ready. Sarah didn't argue when I suggested we leave. We drove to her place, a few miles out of town, both of us too terrified to stay another night in my house. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of the figures on the card, reaching out to me, their faces twisted with strange, haunting smiles. On Christmas morning, we returned to my house, both of us tense and wary. I half expected to find the card waiting on the porch, but the house was empty, silent. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace, like whatever had haunted me was finally gone. But as I stepped inside, a chill filled the air, and I spotted something on the floor in the middle of the living room. It was the card lying open, the final message written in red ink. "Merry Christmas, we're here now." I froze, every muscle in my body going cold. The room felt wrong, like someone was standing just behind me watching. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, and that's when I saw them. Faces in the shadows, faint but unmistakable, watching from every corner of the room, their expressions blank and unfeeling. I ran from the house and never went back. I moved across the country, changed my number, tried to forget. But every Christmas, without fail, I find an envelope in my mailbox, no return address, my name written in looping, old-fashioned handwriting. And every year I don't open it, but I know it's waiting, just like they are, closer than I think. I found the snow globe at a thrift shop the week before Christmas, buried beneath a pile of dusty holiday decorations. There was something strange about it, different from the others in the display. It was heavier, almost too heavy for its size, and the glass was thick, with a dull, almost eerie quality. Inside, it held a miniature village, perfectly preserved under a blanket of white, with tiny Victorian-style homes, a little church, and a frosty line of pine trees along the edge. I shook it, watching the snow swirl, but something felt off. It was too realistic, like a tiny world trapped in glass, waiting for someone to watch. The man at the counter saw me looking at it and nodded, his face turning pale. "That one," he murmured, "always seems to find its way back here. A collector's item, I suppose." But he trailed off, refusing to say more, and I, not usually superstitious, bought it anyway, thinking it would look nice on my mantel. That night, I placed it beside a few candles on the mantelpiece, admiring the way the snow sparkled in the candlelight. I gave it another shake and watched as the flakes drifted down, covering the tiny rooftops and settling softly against the windows of the little church. But when I set the globe down, I felt a sudden chill. In the dim light, the village inside seemed different, as though something had changed. I leaned in, squinting, and realized that one of the windows, on the second floor of a small house in the corner of the village, had a tiny flicker of light, almost like a candle. I laughed it off as a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the fireplace. But as I turned to leave the room, I felt an odd pull, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned, but of course there was nothing there. The next night, as I was getting ready for bed, I passed by the snow globe and felt compelled to pick it up again. The village looked just as I'd left it, buried in snow, but now two of the windows had faint, flickering lights inside. I shook it lightly, watching the snow fall, and realized I could almost hear something. A faint, distant music, like a carol being sung far, far away. I held my breath, trying to listen, but the sound faded the moment I focused on it. I set the globe back down and went to bed, though I barely slept, thinking about that strange music, the flickering lights, the way the little village seemed to come alive in the dark. The following morning, I woke to a fresh dusting of snow outside my house, blanketing the town just like the village in the globe. As I passed by the mantle, I noticed something that stopped me cold. 3 small figures stood in the village square, huddled together, as if waiting. I knew for a fact they hadn't been there before. These weren't just little figurines. They seemed aware somehow, their faces turned upward, gazing out from the globe. I picked it up, feeling that same chill run down my spine. I could swear the figures were staring at me, their faces blank, mouths open in silent song. And then, as I held the globe, I heard it again, the faint, haunting sound of distant singing, echoing from somewhere deep inside the glass. Silent night, the voices murmured, soft and hollow, almost pleading. The longer I held the globe, the louder the singing became, filling my ears, my mind, until it felt like the sound was pressing against my skull. I dropped the globe, stepping back in horror. It didn't break, didn't even crack, just settled back on the mantle, perfectly intact. But the figures were gone, vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. I wanted to throw it away, take it back to the shop, anything to get rid of it, but something inside me held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside that globe, it wanted something from me. The next night, just before midnight, I woke to the sound of faint singing echoing through my house. My heart pounded as I crept down the stairs, following the voices. They were coming from the snow globe, the singing growing louder, more insistent, filling the air with an unearthly chill. And then I saw them again, the figures in the village square. Only now there were more of them. A crowd gathered around the tiny church, their blank faces turned toward me. I could feel their eyes on me, pulling me in, their silent mouths moving as though inviting me to join their song. "Come home," a whisper filled the air, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls stretching and bending, as if the very space around me were warping. I felt an overwhelming urge to pick up the snow globe, to stare into it, to let myself fall into the world inside. Just as my fingers brushed the glass, I snapped out of it, my hand recoiling. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, but the whispers and the singing followed, faint but relentless, echoing in the dark. The next morning, I took the snow globe and drove miles to the outskirts of town, to a frozen lake. With a final glance at the village, I threw the globe as hard as I could onto the ice. It shattered, and as it did, a dense fog seeped out, hanging in the air for a moment before dissolving. I could swear I heard the faintest wail, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Relieved, I went home, feeling like a weight had been lifted. But last night, as the clock struck midnight, I heard it again, the distant, hollow singing, faint but unmistakable. And there on my mantle sat the snow globe, perfectly intact, with the tiny village and the crowd gathered in the square, all waiting for me to join them. Every year, I dreaded Christmas Eve. Not for the usual reasons, like spending time with annoying relatives or the stress of holiday shopping. No, it was something darker, something I never told anyone. But this Christmas, I need to get it out there, hoping that somehow, someone else has experienced the same thing. It started 3 years ago, on a snowy Christmas Eve, when I was alone in my small house, tucked away in the woods. My family lived too far away to visit often, and most of my friends were spending the holidays with their loved ones. So, I hunkered down with a cup of spiced cider and a worn-out copy of A Christmas Carol, trying to make the best of it. Around midnight, as I was settling into bed, I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, right outside my window. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too human. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the sound continued, circling around the house, stopping here and there, as if someone were looking in each window. My heart started to pound. I didn't live close to anyone else, and visitors, especially this late, were unheard of. I tiptoed to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtains. Nothing, just snow and shadow. I was about to turn away when, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, tall and thin, wrapped in a long, dark coat. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to breathe, just stood there watching. I froze, not daring to blink, feeling as though if I looked away, they would somehow get closer. And then, just as I was trying to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, the figure raised a hand and waved, a slow, unsettling motion that felt wrong. Like it knew me. I backed away, pulling the curtains closed, heart racing. Who was out there? And what did they want? I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but when I looked back out the window, the figure was gone. The rest of the night, I barely slept, every creak of the house setting me on edge. The next morning, I brushed it off as some late-night prank, or more hopefully my imagination. But then the next Christmas Eve, it happened again. I was half expecting it, and sure enough, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard those footsteps crunching through the snow. This time they were closer, circling right outside my door. I waited, heart in my throat, gripping a flashlight as I listened to the faint sound of something tapping against the window. The figure returned, standing just a few feet from my porch, closer than before. They wore the same long coat, and their face was pale, barely visible beneath a low-brimmed hat. My breath fogged up the glass as I watched, too terrified to move. Then, to my horror, the figure pressed a single, gloved finger against the glass, right where my face was, and traced a small, perfect circle. I stumbled back, and as I did, I heard it, a faint whisper, my name, spoken from somewhere outside, or perhaps even closer, like it was coming from right inside my head. I never saw the figure leave. It just disappeared, melting into the darkness, leaving me shaken and alone. Last Christmas, I tried to escape it. I booked a hotel far from home, a crowded place full of people. I thought that if I stayed somewhere public, somewhere safe, I could avoid whatever was stalking me. I barely slept, my nerves on edge, but midnight came and went without incident. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I'd finally escaped. But when I returned home the next morning, I found something waiting on my doorstep. A small package, wrapped in dark green paper and tied with a black ribbon. No name, no card, no indication of where it came from. Inside the package was a simple glass ornament, but it wasn't empty. Suspended within the glass was a tiny, twisted figure, dressed in black with pale, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. A note was taped to the inside of the box, written in spidery, uneven letters. You can't hide forever. See you next year. Now here I am, sitting in my dimly lit living room, the clock inching closer to midnight on yet another Christmas Eve. The house is silent, and outside, the snow has begun to fall, blanketing the world in an eerie quiet. I hear it again, the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow, drawing closer, stopping just outside my door. The handle rattles softly, and I feel a chill run down my spine. Then comes the tapping, faint and steady, against my window. I don't dare look. I know what I'll see. That pale face, those hollow eyes, staring at me, waiting. I grip my phone tightly, my hand trembling, wondering if this time I should finally call someone for help. But as I reach for the lock, something stops me. From somewhere deep within, a voice whispers, a memory from years ago, one that sounds strangely familiar. You can't hide forever. And with that, I realize something terrible. I don't think it's here to visit me this time. It's here to stay. I had always loved Christmas. It wasn't about the gifts or the tree. It was the quiet warmth, the lights gleaming in the dark, the sense that, for one night, the world paused. So, when my old friend invited me to spend the holiday at his family's cabin in a remote town just north of where we grew up, I accepted without hesitation. The drive took hours, twisting through roads blanketed with snow and shadowed by dark pines. It was already dark by the time I pulled up, and as I parked, I noticed a few other cars by the cabin. Seemed like my friend had invited a few more people to join. Inside, the cabin was rustic but warm. My friend, Daniel, greeted me with a grin, wrapped in a Santa hat and a faded old sweater. He led me to the den, where a roaring fire cast a warm glow. The other guests, a few people from Daniel's childhood I vaguely recognized, seemed to be relaxing by the fire, talking quietly and sipping mulled wine. "Thanks for coming, man," Daniel said, clapping me on the back. "There's something special about Christmas here. You'll see. The evening passed pleasantly enough, filled with laughter and stories about the Christmases we remembered. But by midnight, a strange tension had settled over the group. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The air seemed colder somehow, pressing against us like the icy fingers of the night. Daniel stood up abruptly, holding a small brass bell. "It's time for the tradition," he announced, glancing around the room with an odd look in his eyes. The others exchanged nervous glances, and I felt a strange twinge in my chest. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Every Christmas Eve, just before midnight, we go out to the woods and sing a carol for the silent caroler." I laughed, waiting for someone to tell me it was a joke, but no one did. The room grew uncomfortably quiet, the only sound the crackling of embers dying in the fireplace. "The silent caroler?" I repeated, but no one answered. Daniel just handed me a candle and motioned for me to follow. One by one, we all trudged into the snow, the only light coming from the candles we carried. The cabin loomed behind us, its windows dark and empty, and the night air bit through my clothes. I followed the others, feeling like I was being pulled along by some invisible thread. The woods were silent, the only sound the crunching of snow under our boots. Daniel led us to a small clearing, ringed by tall pines, and gestured for us to form a circle. His face was pale in the candlelight, and I could see his breath puffing out in small clouds. We began singing Silent Night, but the words felt strange in my mouth, heavy and hollow. I realized that no one else was singing very loudly, almost as if they were whispering the song to themselves. A chill ran down my spine as I looked around. I felt as though I were being watched. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure standing just outside the ring of candlelight. I tried to make out the features, but they were shrouded in shadow, blending seamlessly into the night. The figure swayed slightly, almost in time with our singing, and I realized with horror that it was mouthing the words. Daniel's voice broke, and he dropped his candle, backing up slowly. "It's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The others began to step away, their faces tight with fear. But I stood frozen, staring at the figure. It stepped forward, and I saw that its face was gaunt and pale, eyes dark and hollow. Its mouth moved silently, as if trying to join our carol, but no sound came out. The face seemed familiar, and I felt a sharp pang of recognition. I'd seen it before, years ago, on a missing persons poster. The figure's eyes met mine, and a sudden flood of memories hit me: Christmas dinners, laughter, warmth. But then, just as quickly, the warmth turned to cold. It was as if every joyous Christmas memory had been twisted, turned inside out, replaced with darkness. The silent caroler took another step, its mouth stretching into a twisted smile. Its hand, bony and pale, reached out toward me. I stumbled backward, my candle slipping from my grip, and turned to run, not waiting to see if the others followed. I ran back to the cabin, my breath coming in sharp, terrified gasps. Behind me, I could hear faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind, singing in a language I didn't understand. I slammed the cabin door shut, locking it behind me. But even then, I felt the chill in the air, the sensation that the silent caroler was right outside. In the silence that followed, I could still hear faint singing, drifting through the walls of the cabin, as if it were seeping through the very wood. The next morning, I found myself alone. The others were gone, their belongings scattered as if they'd left in a hurry. I searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, but there was no trace of them. Only a single piece of paper, resting on the fireplace, with a few shaky words scrawled in Daniel's handwriting. He took us. "I don't spend Christmas in cabins anymore,"